nutrient timing, it's like a Pandora's box. Like there's so many different options and so many different athletes. And obviously there's two genders and cycling and non-cycling and road and gravel, like everything, right? So what I'm planning on doing tonight is really unpackaging this very complex nutrient timing strategy. And you've heard of nutrient timing. We'll get into it here in a second. But I believe I'm going to stimulate your brain quite a bit. You may want to have a piece of paper and a pen, because I believe you are going to take quite a few notes, especially when we get into the later slides, when we talk about different phases, different opportunities, and different strategies. But super, super excited to be here tonight. So let's jump right into it. I know you're going to have a ton of questions. I'm going to try to respect the time and keep this at the hour. So I'm going to just jump right into it. I think you guys know me. If not, you can spend a quick second looking at who I am, but Shane can kind of fill you in on that part. So what are we doing? What are we talking about tonight? It's all about nutrient timing. So we're going to talk about the benefits, the implementation strategies. And I have a little bit of a different take. I'm sure now that you've seen me a few times on these webinars, you kind of realize that my strategies, my philosophies are a little bit different than regular sport dietitians. I kind of pride myself on that. We're going to talk about metabolic efficiency nutrient timing and glycogen maximization nutrient timing, because here's what's been happening in the sport nutrition world. If you haven't kept up on this, there's only one bowl that we put all of this information in. So researchers and practitioners, we just throw it all in one bowl, like we're in the kitchen, we're doing like a one pot cooking, right? I don't believe we can actually, I don't think we can keep that in one bowl. I think we have to separate it, because there's so many things flying around in terms of different crazy diets and different strategies and different products, that we have to separate these. So you're going to hear me refer to metabolic efficiency nutrient timing, glycogen maximization nutrient timing, and then more importantly, hopefully I'm going to try to teach you how to blend the both, because that's really where the sweet spot is. It's the blending, it's the combination of both of those strategies for nutrient timing. So that's where we're going on this journey tonight. As you have all seen in the past, I do operate on what I call my optimal nutrition system, right? But we've talked about the foundation nutrition. We talked about metabolic efficiency nutrition. We've talked about nutrient periodization. Tonight is all about nutrient timing. So I do want to bring up one thing when it comes to nutrient timing. Nutrient timing is an arm of nutrition, right? So in the field of sport nutrition, as you can see, we really talk about daily nutrition and nutrient timing supporting each other. It's not one or the other. So when an athlete says, hey, can you help me draw up a nutrient timing plan with me? The first thing I have to know is actually a little bit more about your daily nutrition plan, because that facilitates a successful or an unsuccessful nutrient timing plan. So remember, as we're talking about this, your breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, however you feed yourself throughout the day, that is actually starting your nutrient timing plan, or maybe finishing your nutrient timing plan. So I did want to bring that up. And just as a reminder, we saw this either on my second, I can't remember which webinar introduced this, but we do have two energy systems in our body, aerobic and anaerobic. I need to really bring this up again and just remind you, because as you're on the bike, as you're in the saddle, maybe you're starting to enter that what I call intensity phase, build phase, that pre-competition phase. You're doing more intensity. Maybe you're doing more hill repeats, LT intervals, VO2 max intervals, short sprints, whatever it is, right? Pickups. You really have to consider the quality of your training, because when I talk about nutrient timing and I package it into this metabolic efficiency or glycogen maximization, we need to understand what energy system is predominating. So if you recall from a prior webinar that I did, one or the other, they don't get shut off unless you're completely sprinting, right? It's always a combination of energy systems, but you will predominate one or the other in a session, even if it's like a 3 by 10 minute sweet spot, whatever, with maybe a 15-minute warm up, 10-minute, 5-minute cool down. You're just escalating through all of both of these energy systems. So let's keep that in mind when we get a little bit later in this webinar, because we need to define the quality of your training. So when I say quality, I mean anaerobic, right? Anaerobic is completely obviously looking at the ATP CP system, which is that first 10 seconds of burst energy. And then we have anaerobic, what's called glycolysis, which is up to about 2 minutes worth of energy and really high intensity energy. So just wanted to review that before we jump in. Secondly, if you haven't heard of these webinars yet, and I'm sure you've listened to them, but just let's recall nutrition periodization and what that is, right? Nutrition periodization is making sure your daily nutrition and your nutrient timing, which you'll see here in a few minutes, supports your training physical periodization, right? So if you are in a pre-competition training cycle where you're increased intensity, maybe you're spending a little bit more miles in the saddle, right? A little more volume, we need to respect that phase versus an off season versus a base training phase. So I'm assuming most athletes are either exiting their base season or entering or even maybe in the middle of their pre-competition season. So let's just keep that in mind. And again, as a brief reminder, we want to teach you to eat to train. So eat to support your training sessions, not training to support your eating sessions, right? So think about that, because we don't want to justify food. We want to be able to support our training sessions with the necessary macro and micronutrients for that particular session and beyond. And that's the whole purpose of nutrient timing, is really looking at that whole window. Okay, last but not least, before we start getting into it, this is my graphic. You've seen this before, most likely if you've had you've listened to these webinars before with myself. And this is just looking at, you see the colored boxes. Those are the 3 training cycles. Now, every coach and athlete has different terms for them, but they basically hold true for the traditional periodization model, where you will progress from left to right. So you'll go through a prep phase or a base phase. Normally, you go through trying to build endurance, maybe flexibility, a little bit of strength. Then you progress into this competition, pre-competition, or race cycle, race season. And that's really all about intensity. It's about recovery. It's about speed, power, skills, you name it. And then we go into the off season. And I'm not really going to hit off season nutrient timing too much tonight. I will finish with just a brief slide on that, but we're going to spend a lot of time kind of looking at that blue and the yellow, a little bit more on the yellow side, because we've kind of approached races, hopefully races almost right around the corner within a month or 2 or maybe 3 months. So just as a reminder, we're looking kind of the big picture is metabolic efficiency. How do we train our body to become better at utilizing our carbohydrates and our fat stores? And remember, we can go either way with that. We can actually teach our body to burn more carbs and store more fat, or we can teach it to burn more fat and store more carbs. Now, there are benefits to that, and we'll discuss that briefly and more so in the nutrient timing package that I'm gonna give you tonight. But just keep that in mind, that this is a progression, this is a periodization. As Shane is giving you your physical training, we're going to start talking about not only the nutrition periodization, but more importantly, the nutrient timing tonight. Okay, so that said, roll up our sleeves. Nutrient timing. Here we go. So when we talk about that, these are, and this is research-based. So when we talk about before a session, we're really talking about 10 minutes all the way up to 3 hours, maybe even sometimes 4 hours. Some research has actually quoted 3 to 4 hours before you train yourself. So before you head out on the bike or get on the trainer or even do a strength session, right? So think about that. 10 minutes to 3 hours. And we'll talk about this, but there are very different nutrition strategies if you only have 15 minutes before a session versus 2 or 3 hours. So obviously the examples could be, you wake up at dark 30 and you're hopping on your trainer 10, 15 minutes after you hop out of bed, right? So that poses a very, very specific challenge, nutritional challenge, sometimes even a physical challenge, versus if you're training in the afternoon or in the evening where you actually have had a few feedings and you're actually a little bit more hydrated. So that's before. During is obviously during. And here's the thing. And everyone's individual, right? I totally respect that. And it certainly depends on the time of the year and your environmental conditions. But normally we don't really discuss a lot of nutrient timing during a training session unless you're getting over that 45-minute mark or that 60 mark. And that doesn't really count water, right? Water is very important no matter what. That's really like your electrolytes and your calories. So if you have a session under 45 or 60 minutes and it's not a quality session, usually you just have to drink to thirst. And sometimes a lot of athletes don't even drink during that short amount of time. Now, afterwards, there's actually 2, and I hate to call it windows, but I am going to call it windows just for sake of brevity here. So there are 2 windows that are very important after you finish a session. That is immediately upon, like literally, you stop pedaling, you unclip if you're outside, take your helmet off, pack your bike up at your car, or if you're at home, immediately starting up to 15 minutes. That is your first window of opportunity. And then we talk about the couple meals thereafter. And it's usually like 2 or 3 meals within the next 4 to 6 hours. So again, just kind of giving you the geography and the landscape right now. We'll get into the details here in a few slides, but just to give you an idea, these influence each other, right? It's not about before or during or after, right? It's about before and during and after. That's proper nutrient timing. It's not looking at them individually. It's actually looking at them as all pieces of the puzzle that come together. And hopefully we can figure out this puzzle, right? Sometimes it takes a little while to figure that out, but we're really looking at not necessarily segmenting the or with before, during, and after, but it's the and. So really keep that in mind. Daily nutrition, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, precipitates a successful nutrient timing plan. Nutrient timing includes all three of these working in unison together. All right, so before we begin and really launch into this and really give you all this information, we really, when an athlete asks me, talk about nutrient timing and come up with a plan, you really have to think and ask the question, is nutrient timing always the same? And it's absolutely not, right? Just like your training's not the same, your nutrient timing is not the same. Even if you're one of those guys or gals that is they're very very lack of variety in their nutrition plan, that's okay, right? As long as you're getting the nutrients you need. But nutrient timing, you have to dial that in. Sometimes it's a science, sometimes it's more of an art, and sometimes it's a little bit of both. But nutrient timing is not all the same. The reason I say this, and I open with this too, but there are really two specific goals, right? There is a nutrient timing plan to support metabolic efficiency and fat adaptation. And then there's a nutrient timing plan to support glycogen replenishment or maximization, also supporting muscle protein synthesis, and really looking at performance. And we'll start to define this here in the next few minutes. At the end of the day, it's really about how do we combine these? Because remember, as an athlete going through the different training cycles throughout the year, there is a combination. Like this is the pieces of the puzzle. There's a combination of both of these that will really provide you the best nutrient timing system, if you will. And that's really what this is, right? You have a periodization system that Shane gives you for physical training. Nutrient timing should be thought of as a system to follow not only your performance goals, but also your health related goals. And you guys know I'm big on if you can't perform if you're not healthy. So we have to really elevate those health goals. So we do want to talk about how do we coexist both of these metabolic efficiency and glycogen maximization in terms of nutrient timing. This is why I'm so excited, because I've never seen this done before. Because in my trade, it's always about, well, eat carbs, don't eat carbs. Well, don't eat fat because you don't need fat. Maybe you need protein, maybe you don't need protein. No one's really separated it and looked at the timing of it, but most importantly, where you need it in your training cycle. So let's jump into this. I'm super pumped to start talking about this. But as you can see, whoa, big slide, lots of words. It's going to get a little bit confusing, but I'm going to dissect this for us. Okay. So when we talk about nutrient timing, there are some questions to ask. And these are what I did was I actually put down a lot of the questions that I ask athletes when they ask me about nutrient timing, because there are a lot of what ifs and it depends, right? So let's look on the far left. We've got the nutrients. We see fluid, carbohydrate, protein, fat, and electrolytes. Those are the what I call the Fab Five when it comes to nutrient timing. Those are the things we normally talk about. We've got some decent research when it comes to supporting those nutrients, right? Obviously, we're going to talk about before, during, and then after. But if we need to start it before, because we really do, we're not talking about daily nutrition right now because we talked about that previously. We're going to talk about in that 10 minutes to 4 hours before a training session. These are some questions that we really have to start dissecting and asking ourselves, yeah, what are those answers? Like, what are your answers? And this is where you do a little bit of work, because everyone's going to be different, right? So when it comes to fluid beforehand, some questions are, did you just wake up, right? Why is that so important? Well, why is it so important? Because you can actually wake up about 40% dehydrated, maybe even more, depending on how hydrated you were before going to bed, right? So you wake up in an extremely dehydrated state, as is evident by, you guys have all seen this before, the color of your urine, right? Really dark yellow, usually the first void in the morning, you're dehydrated. So obviously that plays a huge role in what we're going to do during and even after for hydration. The second question is, have you had 4 to 6 hours to begin to rehydrate? So 4 to 6 hours is what it takes to start your rehydration process. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing if you hop on your trainer, head out on your bike early in the morning. You're going to be a little dehydrated, but the fact of the matter is we can plan for that if you know that's going to happen, right? So with the fluid intake, we really want to ask really what's going on in terms of the time of the day, because we want to see how well or how much time you've had in hydrating yourself, or I guess rehydrating yourself from the night's slumber. When it comes down to carbohydrate, boy, it's going to get a lot more technical here. What are your goals for the training session? Because a lot of athletes say, well, yeah, I need to eat carbs. I need to throw down a gel or some UCAN or whatever it is. I need to eat a PB&J sandwich, right? Well, you really need to answer these questions first. Like, if your goals for the training session are high quality, remember that anaerobic energy system where you're doing hard LT threshold and above, or VO2 max sprints or sets, yeah, we need to make sure that carbohydrates are part of that before session nutrient timing plan. What is the mode, right? So are you strength training or are you on the bike, right? We'll kind of break that down a little bit here as we go along. And again, I mentioned the intensity. The intensity is related to the energy systems. If it's a low intensity, easy spin, zone 1, zone 2, maybe even low zone 3, that's more aerobic system energy management, right? Versus those sprints and those LT. Are you training more than once a day? I'm going to throw out a lot of golden nuggets, and here comes a golden nugget you should probably remember. It takes about 16 to 24 hours to refill your carbohydrate tank. It's called glycogen. Stored carbohydrates in your body is called glycogen. It takes up to a day to refill your stores. Like, you can't just go down to the gas station, put some gas in your body, and all of a sudden, whoop, I'm good, right? It takes a little while to restore your carbohydrates. So we need to think, and we need to answer the question, do you have 2 sessions? Do you have a strength session? Do you have it in the saddle session, right? Or are you doing 2-a-days, right? Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. So if you have more than 1 session a day, depending on the quality, of course, which is the intensity, you may need to feed or pre-feed carbohydrates a little bit more aggressively. Have you had adequate carbs before training? So have you had, are you just waking up in the morning and you haven't had anything? You're fasted training, or we're going on an empty stomach? Or have you had some time to eat a breakfast or have a little bit of a snack? And in that snack or in that breakfast or meal, if you will, what type of carbohydrates and what quantity of carbohydrates did you really put in your body? And then, are you male or female? Oh my gosh, Pandora's box here. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is probably a 2 or 3 part webinar series, which I hope to bring back here at one point. But males are very different than females. Obviously, we know that for many reasons, but females tend to utilize fat much more efficiently than males do. It does depend on the quality of the session and, of course, the duration of the session. But we know there are hormonal differences to both fat and carbohydrate oxidation or burning utilization between genders. So we do have to consider that a little bit based on the gender specificity of nutrient timing. Okay, going on down to protein. Again, what is the mode and intensity of the training session? If you're doing a really longer session or really, really hard training session in terms of high intensity intervals, or if it's strength training, and I'm talking about strength, I'm not talking about functional, but I'm talking about lifting heavy things where there could be some muscle protein breakdown, we need to consider that before we feed ourselves protein before that session. And then, are you over 40 years old? Oh, sorry, I had to bring that up. It could be 35, it could be 40, it could be 38. What we know, and I've talked about this before, what we know is around the middle of the 3rd decade and definitely starting the 4th decade of life, our body starts to rapidly lose muscle mass, and that's called sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass. So protein is very, very important in preserving muscle mass. So we need to consider this. If we're over 40, we actually have a higher utilization rate and a higher need of protein. We'll talk about that here in the next few slides. For fat, really the question beforehand, like, do you need to feed fat? You need to eat fat before a training session. Well, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do in terms of that session. Like, are you trying to be more efficient in using carbohydrate or using fat? Because once you start consuming carbohydrate in that pre-training feeding window, you're actually going to utilize more carbohydrates and turn down your fat burning response. So if that's your goal, that's the glycogen maximization, then you need to stick with that. If your goal is not to burn through a lot of your carbs because you have a lower quality training session that's more aerobic based, very low, or not very low, but much lower intensity, then maybe we can sneak some fat in there. And I'm not talking about eating like a stick of butter, but maybe you include some olive oil in some scrambled eggs, or maybe a breakfast burrito or something, or you put some avocado, right? I'm just talking about adding some healthier fats in a pre-feeding. Totally depends on the session. I would not expect you to do that if you've got a high intensity interval session, because that's going to come right up, right? For electrolytes beforehand, are you going to eat something? So a lot of times we get these electrolytes, and let me just back up really quick. There are 5 main electrolytes that we talk about in nutrient timing strategies. Those are sodium, which is the most important. And the only reason it's most important is because it is the one nutrient or one electrolyte that is found in most quantity in our sweat. So that's the one we lose quite a bit in sweat. So we have sodium, we have chloride, which is part of salt, right? Sodium chloride. Then we've got potassium, which we've all heard of. We've got calcium, and we've got magnesium. So those 5 are super, super important. But usually what we talk about when it comes to nutrient timing is most likely sodium based. Now, it doesn't mean I'm a huge fan, as you'll see in the next few slides, of having an electrolyte supplement, a powder or something, if you will, that has a combination of all those. But if you just use sodium, that is like the main one that we actually need to focus on. So are you going to eat something? Because a lot of times all of these electrolytes are in food, most likely. And are you following a sodium loading protocol? Oh boy. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that, but if you need to follow us, and there's so many ifs, ands, or buts here, but if you're an athlete who sweats a ton and you know that in your sweat, you are actually losing a lot of sodium, a lot of salt, there is a strategy called sodium loading that is actually supported by research. And I actually wrote an ebook on this, kind of defining the strategy of how to do that. You actually start it the night before a quality session or before a race competition, and then you continue it in the morning of. So that's why I put on there, if you're following a sodium loading protocol, you will actually need a small bolus of sodium about 60 to 90 minutes before your competition, only if because you kind of have to top off your stores, if you will, right? So I don't want to get too much into that, but I can certainly answer questions about that. So those are the before questions, right? And that's just to get us started. Let's move into the during. So now if we go to that middle column, that during, for fluid, is your session longer than 60 minutes? So remember what I said before, anything less than 45 to 60 minutes, there's not an immediate concern unless you are a heavy sweater, you lose a lot of fluid, or it's hot and humid where you live, or even indoors if you're not training with a fan on you, right? Those are opportunities to definitely hydrate yourself. But if the session is longer than 60 minutes, hydration becomes very important during. Again, we'll talk about that in the next few slides. I mentioned it. Are you training in heat and humidity, or is it high and dry? You have to kind of consider your environmental conditions. Do you chew gum? So interestingly, and there's no research on this that I found, but chewing gum actually stimulates your thirst response, right? And personally, like when I ride or when I run, if it's a shorter ride or a shorter run, all I need, usually like under 60 to 75 minutes, I'll just chew a piece of gum, because that stimulates your thirst mechanism. So at least you're not getting dry mouth if you're a mouth breather. Now, I'm not saying you're going to get hydrated from that, not at all, but it's going to keep that thirst stimulation at bay if it's a shorter session. Okay, going down to carbohydrate. Big one. So carbohydrates, we're going to pick on carbs quite a bit because there's super, super interesting research. And really, for the past 50, 60 years on carbs, it's been changing right and left, right? But really, when it comes to, do I need to eat carbohydrates during a session? We need to ask the question, what's the training mode? So again, are you on the bike? Are you lifting weights? Are you doing something else, right? What mode is it? Are you metabolically efficient? So have you trained your body to actually be more fat adapted in the past month or 2 or 3 months? Because that's going to differ your carbohydrate needs during. Like, think about it. You guys are all very intellectual individuals. If you're training your body to be more metabolically efficient, you are actually conserving or preserving your carbohydrate stores quite a bit, because you're teaching your body how to burn more fat at low to moderate intensity efforts, right? So are you metabolically efficient? Here's a little stat I threw in there, and I thought it would become very, very important as we talk about this, but 2 hours of moderate intensity or 1 hour of high intensity training can lower your glycogen, your stored carbohydrates, by up to 70%. So think about the session, or again, it is all packaged around what kind of session do you have? If it's an hour of intervals or just even a 2 hour, zone 2, zone 3 ride, you can actually decrease your glycogen stores by up to 70%. However, if you are more metabolically efficient, there is no research in this, but what we know from real life data and testing is that your glycogen stores don't take as much of a hit because you're using more fats, right? Okay, how about protein during? Do I need to eat protein? Do I need amino acids? Do I need this product? Do I need that product? Well, again, what's the training mode? What's the duration? What's the intensity? Again, if you're usually what the research says, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but usually over about 6 hours in the saddle, that's when your body starts to actually, I don't want to say need, but it can use a very small amount of amino acids specifically. So if you're going to use protein during a competition or during long training, like long tours or stage races, then you don't necessarily want to eat whole proteins because they're a little bit harder to digest. You want to do amino acids, right? And that's why all these amino acid powders are on the market, and they work very well. They're just a little bit more denatured or broken down proteins, right? For fats, really, are you an ultra cyclist? Are you an ultra athlete? Like if you're going to be out there for a while, you need calories, right? And it's really tough to be out there for 12, 24, 36, however many hours and not eat fat, right? It's not impossible, but it's very difficult, especially on your GI system. So that's an easy one. Either you're an ultra cyclist or you're not an ultra cyclist, right? And that will dictate if you need fat or not. Down to electrolytes. Similar to fluid, is your session longer than 60 minutes? If not, you likely do not need electrolytes unless you're out in the sun and it's humid, and it's even for an hour session if you're losing a lot of sweat, right? Are you training in heat and humidity? Do you have a high salt daily nutrition plan? So do you eat a lot of salt in your normal breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks? Because if you do, a lot of times your body, so the body regulates itself really well when it comes to sodium, right? And what a lot of research has said is if you have a high salt intake, then you actually need to have a high salt intake during training because that's what your body is used to. Now, if you constantly have a high salt intake, your body gets really good at that. And I'm not talking like, oh yeah, the past 2 weeks I've gone on the bender, but just normally, right? If you follow that standard American diet, if you will, is super high sodium, then your body gets used to that, right? If your body's used to it, then you actually don't need that much sodium. Because if that's the way your body is made and the way it responds, your body regulates sodium very well, or else you would die, right? Your cells would just not explode, but you would die because it wouldn't regulate sodium too well. And then, are you a heavy sweater? So we know, here's actually a really good story, and it'll become more important the next 2 slides or 3 slides here, but I am a super heavy sweater, right? I live in Colorado. It's not that humid here, and I just sweat a ton. Take me to humidity and it's game over, right? But interestingly enough, because I've had this testing done, the sodium concentration in my sweat is actually very low. So even though I sweat a lot, my body regulates the sodium so well, it actually absorbs and keeps a hold of my sodium. So I actually don't need a lot of sodium supplementation per hour, even though I sweat a ton. So, and this is where kind of the test don't guess comes in. We can talk about that sweat sodium concentration testing here in the next few minutes, but just something to think about if you've ever had an opportunity to have that tested before. Okay, now let's move over to the after. Really, it's looking at health, it's looking at performance. Like, what are your goals here? And for fluid intake, it's really about how well you did before and during, right? Because that will dictate how much hydration you need after you finish a training session. But for the fat, the carbs, the protein, really it's all about what are we trying to do in the big scope of things, right? Do we need to really slam a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio immediately afterwards? Do we just need to eat a meal? Do we need to eat anything depending on the session? Can we just wait for a snack a little bit later? So we have to package this a little bit differently based on what your goals are, what your training cycle is, and more importantly, what we're trying to do in terms of kind of refilling our carbohydrate tank again. So those aren't even all of the questions, but those are the majority of questions to start getting through your head as we progress here. So here's where we're going. I talked about this before. Nutrient timing. We've got 2 little arms of it, 2 spokes, if you will, right? We've got metabolic efficient nutrient timing. We've got glycogen maximization nutrient timing. real world application, we combine the both of them, right? That is the best strategy. And that's what I help athletes do, is we kind of pick these things apart and combine them. Sometimes it's tough to do. And not a funny story, but an ultra runner I work with, he just contacted me, and we were doing a lot with metabolic efficiency these past 3 or 4 months. He's lost like 25, 30 pounds. He's kind of, he's feeling great. He's an ultra runner, so a lot of time on feet. That said, he's having problems because he just moved into his next training cycle with his coach, which is a more intense training cycle. And he emailed me, and we're going to do a session here next week. He emailed me, he's like, I can't fuel myself. Like I'm having a really big issue fueling these high intensity training sessions. And it's purely because he hasn't combined the metabolic efficiency with glycogen maximization yet. Like he hasn't taught his body how to actually utilize carbohydrates at the rate that his body needs them now. So I'm going to break them up, but really at the end of the day, we're going to try to combine both of them. Okay. I will tell you this, it's a little more difficult to do because all of this is so individual. And even though I can tell you all this great information, what it boils down to, it's an N of 1 experiment, right? We need to see what's going to work with your body, but I'm going to give you all the tools in your toolbox so you can start utilizing them. Okay, let's start with metabolic efficiency nutrient timing. So I'm not going to do any background on metabolic efficiency, but just remember that is teaching the body to utilize more of its fat stores so it preserves its carbohydrate stores, right? Great health benefits, great performance benefits when done at the right time of the year. Okay, so we've seen this chart before, right? We've got the 5 nutrients, the Fab 5. We've got the before, we've got the during, we've got the after. Let me dissect each one here. So fluid. Before training, remember that's the 10 minutes up to 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours beforehand. I call it the Goldilocks prehydration, right? In research, which you will actually see on the next glycogen maximization slide, in research gives us very specific numbers based on body weight and ounces. When it comes to metabolic efficiency, as you probably remember, I'm trying to help you teach your body to understand when it's hungry, when it's full, when it's hydrated, when it's dehydrated. So the Goldilocks is really about finding the best strategy. It's not the too hot or the too cold or the too comfy or not the too comfy. It's about finding the one right in the middle that fits you the best. It takes a little bit of an experimentation process, right? And that's why if you have a race probably within the next 8 weeks, probably not the best time to experiment with this, although it could be too, right? I mean, if you need to really nail this down, but you should probably start getting in tune with what your hydration needs are. But the Goldilocks is looking at your urine color. I know it's a very rough guesstimate, but besides that first void in the morning, your urine color and your urine frequency can actually give you a good idea of your hydration strategies throughout the day. So before carbohydrate wise, what do we need to be thinking about? Well, are we doing these sessions fasted? I know we spent a little time talking about fasted training last time. There are benefits, as I've told you, mostly for males, not necessarily females, because it seems to kind of mess up the hormones a little bit more in females than it does with males. But are we going to go fasted? Is it going to be a light snack? But more importantly, again, what's the session like? Like, do you need carbohydrates, what I call on board, or is it an aerobic session? Like if it's intervals, hills, or even just a little bit longer, like in zone 3, tempo and above, yeah, you're going to absolutely need some carbohydrates. But if you're getting up and you're doing a 45 or 60 minute or even 90-minute session, easy spin on the trainer, zone 1, zone 2, I can maybe make an argument for this metabolic efficiency nutrient timing. If you're a male, maybe you don't need a lot of stuff in your body until you can eat breakfast afterwards. So there are different strategies and different opportunities throughout the year to try that fasted training. A big question is, are you immunosuppressed? And I thought I'd really throw this in, obviously, with COVID, and granted, things are getting a little better, but if you have an immunosuppressed or compromised immune system, carbohydrate feeding beforehand is extremely important. Or if you're feeling like you're getting sick, or if you have asthma or anything where the immune system has actually attacked itself a little bit, like an asthma situation, or even COVID for that matter, right? If you're immunosuppressed, you have to add carbohydrates in your pre-training. You should not do anything fasted because your immune system really functions better with carbohydrates. Okay. I put down there 0 to 20 grams, that's 0 to 80 calories. In a metabolically efficient nutrient timing system, you really don't need much unless you are immunocompromised. Because again, what are we trying to do in metabolic efficiency? We're trying to teach the body to burn more fat, right? Okay. Down to protein. Again, if you're going to do a fasted session, obviously you don't need protein, but if you're going to include something, that 0 to 20 grams, just like carbohydrate, that 1-to-1 ratio is pretty darn good for setting up positive blood sugar control. It gives you some calories moving into a session, not a lot. So again, if it's a high quality, high intensity session, these nutrients, these amounts will not even touch your needs, right? But that, again, this really shouldn't be part of the metabolic efficiency, at least part of your prep or base cycle. Remember, your prep or base cycle is more that lower intensity, low to moderate intensity. So we're only talking about the prep and base cycle here. In terms of fat beforehand, I would say if you're going to eat something, make it minimal. Don't gorge yourself with a lot of fat because it actually impedes the body's digestive rate. So if you want to have a little bit of a rock sitting in your stomach while you're on your bike, I mean, so be it. But I've known a lot of cyclists who can digest things crazy fast, and others, they can't even like smell food without getting GI distress. So obviously everybody is different when it comes to that. In terms of electrolytes, this is metabolic efficiency base prep cycle. You don't really need a lot. I mean, honestly, for the most part, you can just get it whatever is in food or whatever's in your snack. Now, moving to the during, remember again, what's the goal of metabolic efficiency? Teaching our body to improve our fat burning or fat oxidation response. So during, do we need fluid during a session? Well, I would argue, yes, we do. It just depends on the session. Like, are you outside? Are you inside? Is it hot? Is it humid? What's your sweat rate like? Is it under an hour? Is it over an hour? I think it's safe to say that, having a bottle an hour is a pretty general guideline. I always start with about a bottle to about a bottle and a half. And I'm talking about just a normal cycling size water bottle, 20 to 22 ounces. I think that's fairly healthy when it comes to basic recommendations. And then you can kind of titrate it up or down from there based on your needs. Now, based on carbohydrates, there's really a timing mechanism here. So if you're doing anything under 4 hours, and why did I pick 4 hours? If you're doing low intensity training, even low to moderate intensity training, even though after 2 hours you can deplete your carbohydrate stores by up to 70%, you still have carbohydrates in your system, right? You still have it mostly in your muscle that you're utilizing. If you're trying to improve your metabolic efficiency, it could actually be to your benefit to go a little bit longer without calories. And I would say fluid and maybe some electrolytes for sure, but maybe without calories. But be safe. Like, this is what I always tell athletes, like, carry something in the pocket just in case, because of course I don't want anyone to bonk and that to become a very, very dangerous situation, right? If you're going over 3 to 4 hours, usually I recommend in a metabolic efficiency phase, nutrient timing system or phase, 10 to 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour. That doesn't sound like a lot. Banana usually has about 20 grams. A gel usually has about 20 to 25 grams, just to kind of give you an idea. Normal Cliff Bar, regular Cliff Bar I think has around 40 to 45 grams of carbohydrates. So just to kind of package that, you don't need a lot in this phase. When it comes to protein, usually nothing. Not for this phase, for sure. If you're just spending anything under 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours, you don't need any protein. Same thing with fat. You certainly don't need any fat during this phase, unless you are an ultra cyclist and your volume is already taking off during this cycle. Then of course you're going to need calories. You're going to have to include some type of fat, because fat is more nutrient dense to actually keep you having some calories throughout those longer rides. When it comes to sodium specifically, it's somewhat debatable. There's a lot of 50-50 on the fence, even researchers arguing right now in terms of electrolytes and sodium supplementation. What we know, what I know from not doing research, but real life, because I measure sweat sodium concentration in athletes, and I know the company that does this, so I've tapped into their data. We know there's about a range from 300 milligrams all the way up to 200 milligrams of sodium, that's the Na, per hour. That's a huge range, but that's the range that I've actually seen in testing athletes, and this other company has seen in testing athletes. So I know it's a huge range, but it kind of gives you somewhere to start. Personally, I used to dose myself around 1,200 milligrams per hour until I got that testing done. And then I found out I only needed roughly 600 to 700 milligrams per hour. But with sodium, you're going to sweat it out. So there's no, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, do I need to really consider my health and any health concerns? Well, certainly if you have any family history, or if you have hypertension, high blood pressure, yes, we probably shouldn't supplement a lot, but your body does sweat out a lot of sodium, so it somewhat regulates itself. Mixed electrolytes are ideal, like I talked about earlier, not just sodium if you can help it, but having the sodium, the chloride, the potassium, calcium, magnesium would be fantastic. And there's a couple brands, a a couple products out there that actually put all 5 of those together. Whew, okay, let's talk about after now. So you get off the bike, and again, with the fluid, it's just about kind of feeling out your body, right? Don't overdrink, don't underdrink. It's kind of that Goldilocks post-hydration. Everything else in a metabolic efficiency nutrient timing plan that is done early season, and that's why I really wanted to highlight prep or base cycle, really that 1-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio is ideal, because we don't want to spike blood sugar. We don't want to spike insulin, because remember, our goal here is not necessarily glycogen refeeding and maximization. Our goal is to continue on metabolic efficiency. And that's why I put during the base cycle. Okay. Let me, oops, sorry about that. Okay, so now this is ME, or metabolic efficiency. This is starting the blend. Now this is really important. So we laid the groundwork, right? That was base training. Now we're getting into the intensity competition cycle. This is where we start to combine metabolic efficiency nutrient timing with glycogen maximization. This is what a lot of athletes forget, or they don't know how to do it correctly. We need a bridge. You can't just do metabolic efficiency and then jump to glycogen maximization. We need a bridge there to connect them, and this is the connecting piece. So let's look at this. Beforehand, in terms of fluid, well, you should probably have your fluid, your pre-hydration figured out. If not, because it's maybe getting a little warmer now, you're going to have hopefully a few more weeks to dial that in. When it comes to carbohydrate, this is where we actually, if you remember the previous slide, I called for 0 to 20 grams of carbohydrate. Now we're looking at 0 to 40 grams. Now, most of you, because I don't know you, so I'm going to make a generalization. Most of you will not do fasted training at this point. I could be wrong. Again, kind of depends on what type of athlete you are. If you're an ultra cyclist who's out there for a long, long time, much lower intensity, you may not do a lot of food beforehand. But for the majority of athletes who are bridging this gap to glycogen maximization, you actually need to refeed a little bit more carbohydrates. And here's why. Perk up your ears really quick. When you don't feed a lot of carbohydrates, and I'm not going to get too technical on this, but there is an enzyme in your body that helps carbohydrate metabolize. It's called PDH, or pyruvate dehydrogenase. That will actually become suppressed or decreased when you don't eat a lot of carbohydrate. And that's fine until you need to burn carbohydrates and store carbohydrates. So this is why a lot of athletes miss the boat. They go from this metabolic efficiency, which is not utilizing a lot of carbohydrate because you're preserving more of it, and then they try to replenish their carbs overnight, and it just doesn't work, because from an enzymatic level, you've suppressed that enzyme reaction. So we actually need time, and it doesn't take that long, but you need time to get that enzyme functioning again and functioning to full force, if you will. So this is why I recommend in this bridge time to actually feed a little bit more carbohydrate, up to 40 grams in that pre-feeding window. It can be 10 minutes all the way up to 3 hours beforehand. In terms of protein, we don't need a lot more protein. In fact, the recommendations stay the same, 0 to 20. You don't need a lot of protein, especially before you hop in the saddle and go out for a ride. We're going to talk about protein afterwards, which becomes a little more important. Same thing with fat, same thing with electrolytes, same recommendations. The big showstopper was we need to start adding carbohydrates in that pre-feeding. Even if you've done fasted training, we need to start adding those in. So when it comes to during, what are you doing on the bike or during training? Well, it does depend. Obviously, this is the time of the year where you're doing more in the saddle, you're doing more intense, you're sweating more, right? So this is the time where I promote, I cannot stand the scale for many reasons, because it's just an eyesore, number one, but it doesn't give you valid information. But it does give you this. It gives you how much weight you lost, which is usually fluid, before and after a session, right? So during that session, you can actually measure how much fluid you've lost. And I think that's great application, because if you can do, and I do this on myself too, I went on a longer run this weekend and I weighed myself beforehand, and you have to do that, almost butt naked or pretty butt naked, so your clothes don't hold moisture. And then afterwards, weigh yourself again, same scenario. If you've lost more than 1 or 2 pounds, you need to do a much better job at pre-hydrating and hydrating during, because that's usually the marker. It's usually about 2 to 3%, maybe even 1% for some athletes, loss of body weight. But that becomes like, when I say sweat rate testing, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about measuring your body weight before and after training sessions to see how much you're losing. Because, like, personally with my goal is to stay under a pound of body weight lost, that's when I know that I've done a good job at pre-hydrating and a good job at hydrating during my session, right? So that can kind of give you an idea of what you're trying to do during is, yes, you need to have fluid. And again, that bottle to bottle and a half an hour, I've seen some athletes up to 2 bottles an hour. Keep in mind this, and this seems to bounce around in terms of numbers. Keep in mind that the stomach can only process roughly about a liter of fluid per hour. That's about 33 ounces per hour. Now, I've seen some cyclists blow that out of the water. They can do 40 to 50 ounces per hour. And I've seen some who can't even do a liter per hour. They just get a lot of gastric distress and a lot of distension and bloating. So usually if you stay under that liter per hour, which is about 33 ounces, you're relatively safe in terms of hydrating during a ride or during a competition. So let's get into the carbohydrates during. So what do you need to have in your pocket? What do you need to have on board during this bridge cycle, this intensity competition? We're trying to get to glycogen maximization. Well, again, anything under 60 minutes, 75 minutes, probably not a lot, unless you're doing some really intense intervals. If you're doing a really hard interval session, then absolutely feed the grams per hour that you see right underneath. So that's the greater than 60 minutes or 75 minutes. That could even be a long ride, right? In zone 2 or zone 3. But so I would say under 60 or 75 minutes, super high intensity, or beyond 60 to 75 minutes at a lower intensity. We need to start teaching your training. I call it enzyme training. Remember, I talked about the enzyme complex. We need to start training the body to actually process and metabolize carbohydrates efficiently again. So that's where that 20 to 60 grams per hour comes into play. Now, I think your eyeballs are gonna pop out of your sockets when you see the next couple slides. So just kind of remember some of these numbers as we're talking through these, right? Protein, again, under a few hours, you don't need a lot of protein. If you're going to go over 4, 5, 6 hours, maybe some amino acids on board at low amounts, it's usually about 10 to 15 grams an hour. You don't need a lot, right? I usually don't even put that in most recommendations unless the cyclists are doing some ultra events. Fat, same thing, unless you're an ultra athlete and we need some fat. We just need to be careful with what sources of fat. I think personally, I work a lot with ultra runners and ultra cyclists, and I found a huge difference in dietary choices between runners and cyclists. Like runners will try to just eat everything regarding fat, and I don't know why, because it doesn't digest correctly. Whereas cyclists are a little more methodical in what they're choosing, right? Same exact recommendation with electrolytes, specifically sodium. So you should have kind of polished that a little bit. Actually, this is the time to polish. You should have figured out about how much sodium you need in that previous cycle. And then afterwards, same exact message with fluid, right? It's that Goldilocks, like how much, if you can incorporate that sweat rate testing with the body weight pre and post, that's awesome. Because for every 16 ounces that you lose, for about every pound that you lose of fluid, you want to consume about a bottle of not just water. So water doesn't really rehydrate you. It has to have some type of salt and electrolytes in it and a little bit of carbohydrates. But you want every pound that you lose, you want to have about a bottle of fluid, electrolyte fluid and carbohydrate fluid to help replenish. And you probably have heard of chocolate milk. Actually, chocolate milk has got some really good research behind it in terms of its rehydrating properties, even its carbohydrate replenishment properties. So when we go down into carbs and protein, we can still do the 1-to-1, but I actually start promoting a little bit more of a 2-part carbohydrate to 1-part protein. Because again, you're starting to try to refeed your carbohydrates and get your refeeding process a little bit more efficient in terms of the enzyme complex that's kind of lost its zeal. You're trying to get that back a little bit. So you don't have to stuff your face, but we do want to include a little bit more carbohydrates in that post workout or post competition session. Same thing with fat and electrolytes during or with your meal, with your snack. You don't need to go out of your way, not during this cycle. Now watch what happens as we go into the next cycle. So I know this is a lot of information. Stay with me here. Stay with me. I'm gonna get super excited about this next one. Now we're talking about, all right, we've done our metabolic efficiency. We've done our metabolic efficiency nutrient timing. We've done that bridge that I just talked about. Now it's all about performance. Right? Performance at the right time of the year, which is kind of what we're in, where you guys are at. This is the late prep phase, late base phase, competition cycle. It's pretty much where I think everybody is at right now that's listening to this webinar. So let's look at this. What has changed, right? Beforehand, in terms of fluid, you should have that dialed in by now. I mean, honestly, you should pretty much know that. Here are some major changes. When it comes to how many carbohydrates you should feed beforehand, and I'm going to look around for a calculator really quick. I don't have one. I've got my phone. I'm going to do a quick calculation for you. We know, and this is current research, we know that if we're talking about glycogen maximization, we want to consume 0.5 to 2.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So say you weigh, let's see, get the calculator. Say you weigh 180, let's say we have a male weighs 180 pounds. 180 pounds divided by 2.2 will give you your body weight in kilograms. That body weight is 81.8 kilograms. So let me just do this easy math for you. 81.8, I'm going to multiply that by 0.5. That's 41 grams of carbohydrate. Remember what you saw last time, the upper limit was 40 grams, right? So now we're starting to refeed a little bit more. If I do that higher, that 2.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, that gives us 180 grams. So now that 180-pound male should consume between 41 to 180 grams of carbohydrate in that window, that 10-minute up to three-hour window, right? Depends on how much your body can handle in terms of your stomach. So all of a sudden we see increased needs for carbohydrate and protein, right? So you can do the same math with the protein. So what we're seeing is we need a little bit more protein and a lot more carbohydrate in this specific goal or this specific phase in which our goal is maximizing glycogen, maximizing carbohydrate, not only usage, but also storage, right? Fat, electrolytes, same messages that we've been saying, right? Meal and a snack, try to get that through real food if you can, right? You can certainly use supplements if you need to for some electrolytes. I get that, right? Let's talk about during now. Now, what we know about fluid, so how much should you hydrate during competition cycle or during heavier training, higher quality training? This is fairly dated research and has not been updated for probably over a decade now, but the dated research indicates that you should consume 3 to 6 ounces of fluid every 15 to 20 minutes. Now, I feel more comfortable in what I told you in the previous slide. Your body can utilize up to about 1 liter, which is 33 ounces per hour. So if you do the math, what the research is saying is we should consume about 12 to 24 ounces per hour. The stomach can handle up to 33, depending on the type of athlete, the type of terrain, the heat, humidity. Because here's the thing too, I didn't mention. When it gets warmer outside, that heat response, the environmental condition, actually decreases your body's ability to absorb fluid and absorb calories, because there's what's called a blood shunting response. When it gets hot outside, the blood moves from your gut to your extremities, your arms and your legs specifically, because you're cycling, right? It's trying to dissipate the heat by bringing more blood to the surface of the skin. So it takes it away from the gut. And that's one reason why it's so difficult to eat a large amount of calories during a ride or during a race, is because of in the heat, because of that blood shunting response. So something to keep in mind there. How about carbohydrates per hour? Well, here's where it starts to get fun. 30 to 60, actually even up to 90 grams per hour. That's 120 to up to 360 calories per hour. That's actually the recommendation, the current recommendations. Now, here's the interesting point, and that's line or in the second row here on this carbohydrate table or column is why did I put 90 to 144 grams per hour? Well, here's the cool part. I get pretty geeky when it comes to the science. When a carbohydrate mixture is in a ratio of a 2-part glucose, that's GLU, to 1 part fructose, which is FRU. Those are both sugars, right? Both monosaccharides are simple sugars. When the ratio is in that combination, the intestine, the small intestine, and not to geek out, but I'm gonna tell you anyway, the small intestine has receptors for glucose and fructose. So back in the old days, like when the Gatorade was born and all that, that was simply glucose based, right? And that went through the small intestine, but you could only put so much glucose through that one receptor. What researchers have found is that there's a fructose shuttle, if you will, that now if we have both sugars at a certain ratio, you can maximize and actually increase absorption of carbohydrates across the small intestine. All this means is if you have something that has more of a 2-to-1 ratio, glucose to fructose, not to be confused with my carbohydrate to protein ratio, right? But glucose to fructose, you can actually play with your body absorbing more carbohydrates during. Now, I have not, this is just me personally in the field, I've not had great success with my athletes because you definitely, it's not like you can go out tomorrow and just try to start consuming 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Like you have to definitely get your system up and running efficiently to be ready for that. So that's a huge thing. So maybe start at the 60 and go up to 80 the next week, and then maybe go up to 100 the next week and see how your body's responding. But it has to be in a glucose fructose mixture of 2-to-1. Okay. That is really asking the question, do you need maximal calories? Like, do you need more calories? Are you an ultra cyclist? Or are you a guy that just burns, guy or girl that burns crazy amount of calories during a session or during a race, right? Usually I've seen more of the ultra cyclists needing to employ these strategies, or like Ironman triathletes who are going a little bit longer at higher intensities. So if you do need more calories and you really aren't finding that you can absorb a lot of carbohydrate, you can actually add protein, specifically some amino acids like we've been talking about. You can add protein to that mixture to try to improve just total calories. It's not all coming from carbohydrate, but it's total calories. And I've worked with a lot of ultra cyclists, stage cyclists, where we have put in some protein and fat for that matter, just because they need more calories. But there are some really cool science things that you can use in terms of increasing absorption of carbohydrate. So with protein, as I just mentioned, if you need more calories during a session or during a race, then you can certainly add protein to the carbohydrate, or vice versa. Fat is, it's the broken record. Unless you're an ultra cyclist, you usually don't need a lot of fat, right? And then electrolytes, we talked about the Fab Five, right? The sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium. If you can get sweat sodium concentration testing done, there are a couple of ways of doing that. The system I use is a system that they use in a clinical setting that basically it's a non-sweat test. So I just put electrodes on your forearm. It stimulates the sweat response. Voila, we have it. There are patch kits out there. Actually, I just heard Gatorade came out with a patch kit. I don't know if it's out on the market yet, but you literally just slap a patch on your arm or your back or neck or something, and you go out and train, and it actually collects your sweat. And I believe you send it into them and they analyze it. So there's some easy ways to measure your sweat sodium concentration. That is different than sweat rate. Remember, sweat rate is stepping on the scale before and after. Sweat sodium concentration, you actually have to wear a patch or go into, usually it's a performance center that does that type of testing. Whew. Okay, going after the rider, after the competition, we need to be very methodical here, because remember, you're losing glycogen. You're using a lot of it from your muscles because this is a little bit higher intensity phase, right? You're training more frequency, maybe you're racing, soon. We need to make sure you're hitting these numbers. And this is the only time where I become numbers focused, not in daily nutrition, but in nutrient timing plans. So we know after training, every pound that you lose, again, I said that bottle, that's just an easy reference, but technically it's 16 to 24 ounces of fluid that you need to replenish for every pound of body weight that you've lost, right? So again, the goal is, like, you don't want to drink 3 or 4 bottles afterwards. So the goal is to pre-hydrate and hydrate during a little bit better. From a carbohydrate standpoint, you just need to do a little bit of math. Like, the first thing you need to do is, again, take your body weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2 right now. Those are your kilograms, right? Then you can start utilizing these numbers. So here's what we know about carbohydrate replenishment after this type of training. If we're trying to maximize glycogen or carbohydrates, we need to have 1 to 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. Or if you can't get that much carbohydrate, you can lower the carbs, but add protein in there. Now, I'm going to tell you this. I favor the latter, because most of the athletes I work with in terms of recreational, highly competitive recreational, usually they're over 35 or 40. We need protein in our body after most quality training sessions. So I would actually favor using some protein and carbohydrate after those quality training sessions, not just carbohydrate. And that's more from a muscle protein synthesis based on kind of trying to slow that age-related loss of muscle mass. So with protein afterwards, I just talked about that a little bit, but here's some interesting research. I don't know if I told you about this in earlier webinars, but as we there's actually some aging research that provides us some data that as we get a little bit older, from what I've seen, they're only studying like the older population that they call it is about 60 to 65 and older. So we don't have a lot of data in between like that 40 to 60 mark yet, but they're actually finding that as we get older, we actually need more protein in that post-training or post-workout window, because our body doesn't utilize it as efficiently as it did when we were younger. So if you're kind of in that 60 plus, I would definitely favor up to 40 grams of protein. If you're under that 60-year-old mark, I would still say right around 20 to maybe 30 grams of protein in that post-workout window. And that is usually, not to get nitpicky, but I'm a huge fan of whey protein. Whey protein is that fast-acting protein. It really helps to stimulate muscle protein synthesis very quickly. You can certainly get that in foods like dairy foods. You can use a whey protein powder, of course. Some of these products on the market are actually getting very privy to that and putting whey protein powders into their products also for their recovery. Okay, let's talk about fat afterwards. You really don't want to have a ton of fat in that. Remember I talked about the first two, or the two windows? First window is at 0 to 10 minutes, 0 to 15 minutes. Try not to have much fat in that window, because what fat does is it impedes glycogen replenishment. So it kind of, I think of it like as a boxing match, right? And fat is that huge, it's like Rocky IV, right? Fat is that big Russian, and carbohydrates is Rocky and a little bit smaller, right? And initially, right, not at the end, but initially the fat or the Russian, he's gonna take him down a couple times, right? So we don't want fat impeding the glycogen resynthesis, at least not in the first 10 to 15 minutes. After that, it's fine to eat like in mixed meals and everything, but you don't need fat part of that initial plan. And then in terms of electrolytes, you don't need to go crazy with them. Again, food, if you're going to have a beverage that usually has sodium in it, the key thing is this, and I think I said this before, but you don't want to just have water after a quality training session. Water does not rehydrate. What you need some type of water, fluid, right? You need sodium for sure. Some of the other electrolytes would be great, and you need carbohydrates to help the absorption of sodium for the transporters across the small intestine. So in an ideal world, you get that from food, but I know we don't live in an ideal world, and sometimes you just don't feel like eating solid food afterwards. So that, hopefully you've just seen and you've been like, wow, this is, number one, so much information. I do apologize, but I got so excited in giving all this. But two, you can kind of start to see the differences that we need to do as we shift your training. We need to shift your nutrition, but we also need to shift your nutrient timing plans, right? So looking at this very briefly, and then we'll take some questions. Off-season nutrient timing, here's my mantra. You're not really training during the off season, so you don't really need a nutrient timing system, right? All we need to really do is focus on metabolic efficiency, focus on health. If you're not really, like if you're truly in off season, you're probably not really focusing on performance. So focusing on optimizing your blood sugar through real food, like we've talked about in previous webinars, those are your goals for the off season. There is, in my mind, there is no nutrient timing system for the off season. It's really just the base prep, pre-competition, competition season. If I may, let me look at the time. I know I'm a little bit over. I just want to add this really quick. There are two products on the market that are a little bit different than all the other simple sugars. And if you guys have heard of Morton before, Morton has a gel and a drink. And I personally, I cannot speak to this because I have not tried these yet, but I've had athletes who I've recommended, and we've had great success in it. The thing with Morton, very briefly, they actually use a little bit of science. They use this, what's called hydrogel. It's actually a biopolymer. It's a water-based structure, which is from, this hydrogel is from alginate, which is from brown algae, and a polysaccharide, pectin, right? Which is in a lot of different foods. So, and you can read what their drinks do and what their gels do. But it's an interesting concept because this hydrogel basically packages these carbohydrates to be able to increase the quantity of carbohydrates that goes through your stomach. So it gets digested very quickly, but then it maximizes the absorption through your small intestine, because this hydrogel kind of encapsulates this carbohydrate so it can deliver more of the carbohydrate. So again, cannot speak real life because I've not tried it. I plan on doing that this season, but some of my athletes have had great success with it. However, as you look at down below, current research does not support improved performance. So while it has worked in real life, this is where we need to kind of make that distinction: real life versus research. I've had huge success with some athletes, not all, some athletes utilizing this, especially for longer events. And some have really found no difference, but it actually has helped some of my athletes who need more carbohydrate feed more carbohydrate because of this improved technology and this delivery system, if you will. I do have a little link that you can read a little bit more about some of the research if you're kind of geeky like that. So you can kind of read why, various studies in terms of the ones that really, again, it's not to say it doesn't work, because I know it works in real life. It's just the research hasn't proven the efficacy of it working in real life. So that's Morton. I'm sure you guys have heard of Generation UCAN before, because I know Shane has talked about that too. But Generation UCAN is really interesting because it's a carbohydrate delivery system that's based on non-GMO cornstarch, and they basically cook it, right? They cook it with water, they cook it with heat, and it changes the molecular structure of the starch, of the cornstarch itself, to actually have a lower blood sugar response. And you can see their little graph. I just took this from their website. So, you can see their super starch is called, that is the dark blue. And it's basically, they fed maltodextrin versus water versus superstarch, and they found that the superstarch didn't have that blood sugar spike before an exercise session versus maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is like a long chain polysaccharide. So it's a sugar, but it's supposed to kind of burn a little. It's more complex, if you will. So I wanted to bring these two up. Generation UCAN does have a decent amount of research on their product. That's not all funded by them, which is kind of important. And you can read about that at that link also. But I wanted to bring up those two products, not because, I support either of them. I've worked with athletes with both of them and have had great success with both of them, and sometimes even at the same time. But I wanted to just show you that there are other options than just your typical simple sugar, quote unquote Gatorade or Powerades out there. And really that it's kind of led by science, if you will. So hopefully what I've done tonight is not completely confused you, but just remember one thing. At the end of the day, I can give you all this great information, but each and every one of us has a very different gastrointestinal system. We need to be very, very cognizant on what you can handle, right? So I'm saying, yeah, you might need to feed more carbohydrates in a certain cycle. Well, what if your system can't handle that? Like, you just aren't built that way. We really need to look at that, because I've worked with a lot of athletes who want to be very, very overzealous in feeding, but they can't, even when we kind of structure it really methodically. So we just, at the end of the day, just remember that each and every one of us are different. I gave you some awesome tools. That's like the most updated research in terms of nutrient timing. Number one, research. But number two, hopefully I package it to kind of take you from that metabolic efficiency, which I like to teach in nutrient timing, into that bridge into the glycogen maximization, of which is where I think a lot of us are now in hopefully, knock on wood, having a season within 2 to 3 or 4 months from now, because now is really the time to look at how do we maximize nutrition, especially nutrient timing, for performance. So, that was fast. I do apologize for my speed there, but I wanted to cover a lot of information and give you guys guys and girls, a lot of great tools for your toolbox. So I think everyone knows how to get hold of me by now, but there is my contact info. And Shane, I'm totally open for questions if you want to open up the lines, or I'm sure a lot of your athletes will need to digest a lot of this information.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
For sure. You also had
Yeah.
a good aging research on aging. I thought that was a good pun too that you dropped.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, it's 9:11 my time. So let's just do maybe a couple questions, and then we'll respect people's time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I actually want to vouch for Marathon too. I did the gels. I did a 200 mile on Zwift 3 years ago.
Wow.
And
I remember that. Yeah.
Marathon. Remember that? Yeah, I think worked with that. It's like eating a slug, so it's a little gross texture wise, but
yeah,
it definitely works pretty good.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah. So let's do 2 questions. So Benji has one question. If you know, does Scratch have a 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio? If you know that off the top of your head.
I do not know that off the top of my head, Benji. I can easily look, like if you look at the ingredients, usually, I mean, what you're looking for is fructose. I want to say yes, but I don't want to give you the exact answer, because I feel like Alan should have done his research, right? Because he's a really, really intelligent guy.
Yeah.
But I can't give you 100% answer on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then with Paco is back to actually Marathon. Have you seen success with both the gel and the drink?
Absolutely. Yep.
they
Yep. I
prefer.
mean, to your point, Shane, like I haven't had that before, but the same thing that you said with the gel, it's kind of, it's just a weird
It's not a
texture.
great texture. Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
not.
So a lot of my athletes have kind of chosen the drink because of that.
Yeah.
But it kind of depends on really the system that you want. Like if you're doing, ultra and you've got to pack this stuff, it's really hard to pack a lot of water, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's where athletes will pack the gels because it's so much more convenient.
Just slides right down the throat.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Oh.
cool, man. All right, yeah. So let's wrap it because it's already 9:15. So
Yeah.
guys, how to contact with Bob. I know some of you guys work with him since he's been doing this, and I've worked with him for years. So if you have any questions, he's the guy to go to for sure.
Thank you.
And then I will get this back on the website tomorrow, and then Bob, I'll send you a link to this too tomorrow.
Awesome.
Cool, man.
Well, thank you, everyone. As always, it's been a pleasure. I can't wait till our next session. But take a while to really digest this because there's a lot of information on there, and just kind of work through it methodically, especially with Shane and planning your physical periodization.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Bye.
Thank you.